with a lot of information. An interesting experiment that one can do is just look at the pattern of movement of inequality measures over time. And this gets directly into what I'll talk about as a kind of evidence for the importance of financial factors in determining the movement of inequality, without, again, thinking about what these measures mean in absolute terms, but simply making the, let's say, the plausible assertion that they can be usefully compared in terms of percentage changes from one year to the next. What I did was to create a series of overlapping 6-year time intervals, and with the data that I had, I did the percentage change from the beginning of each interval to the end for each country, and then did a color scheme to give you a sense of the degree of change, with pink to red to brown indicating increasingly strong decreases in inequality, and light to dark blue increasingly strong increases in inequality. And the question then is can one see in the data patterns across geographic space which tell us anything or suggest anything about what's going on? And the answer to that is, well, depends upon the time period you're looking at. In the early period of the coverage of this particular data set, of course, there are a lot of countries for which one doesn't have either the starting point or the end point. And in fact, for those that one does have it, the pattern does not suggest anything particularly meaningful. There's increases and decreases. But as one moves along through time, and this gets us to the period of turmoil of the early 1970s associated with the first oil shocks, one discovers that in fact, the maps themselves just begin to convey significant information. That is to say, inequality is rising in the recession-hit importing and industrial consuming countries of the world, the United States, North America, Western Europe, and India. But in the countries which are benefiting on the other side of the transaction from the improvement in terms of trade, which is particularly looked across North Africa and Iran, you see in fact that their internal measure of inequality calculated in the way just described is showing decreases. So we have a very interesting pattern which suggests that the movement of inequality in this period is at least significantly influenced by something that we know happened, which you could say the change in terms of trade between energy exporters and energy importers. If one then moves along into the early 1980s, you get a further dramatic change in which the inequality is now rising practically everywhere on the globe, and rising most intensely, so far as one can measure it, in, for example, the southern continent, Latin America, and the parts of Africa where we can measure something. And what's going on there? Well, this is the period of the global debt crisis, and you can see now that the two types of aspects of my professional personality are now merging in a rather dramatic way, because it turns out that the third world debt crisis of the early 1980s is associated with a very strong and systematic increase in inequality, which is most intense in those countries which have been affected most significantly by that. And then there's an interesting pattern of exception, which includes India, China, and Iran, which did not experience at this period rising inequality in this way. And I suggest that that's a useful way of providing some corroboration for the basic idea, insofar as China did not begin the open door policy until 1979, so it is essentially autarkic. It is not exposed to the influence of global interest rates at this point. India was still in this period substantially free of external financial exposure. It had long-term capital controls and basically restricted itself to borrowing from the International Development Agency, not from commercial banks. And Iran had had its revolution in 1979 and was cut itself off from being influenced by this sort of thing. So we have not only a general global pattern which supports I think the sort of rebuttable presumption that we're looking at macroeconomic and financial events, but we also have a set of exceptions which prevent some cooperation. And then if you move along, well, what you expect to happen in the 1980s and early 1990s does happen, which is to say inequality continues to rise most of the world, but now the locus of rising inequality shifts toward the most extreme measures of it shift toward the former Soviet Union, its former satellites in Eastern Europe, and China. So you have a pattern here of, again, regionally oriented inequality change, closely associated with events that we all know to have been of very substantial global significance. And again, there's an interesting pattern of exception, which is Southeast Asia. And this is the region, of course, at this time, up until 1997, and data for this set of maps went out in 1994, but up to 1997, there was a foreign direct investment fueled Asian tigers boom. And so what is going on here is the exception to the global, to the larger pattern.